What possessed you to escape then? Why did you want to do that?
Well, it's family history, really. My grandfather was captured by the Germans, and he escaped 7 times and got recaptured 6 times.
So it's in your DNA.
And one of his stories was middle of the night, rain lashing down. He's on the Dutch border, German Dutch border, crawling through the mud, and he comes through a culvert, and he sees a tree, and he puts his hand to pull himself forward, except it was a German guard's boot, a border guard. And so I thought to myself, I can't, I got to escape at least once to sort of, you know,
Inspired by the legend.
yes, of my grandfather.
So, what thought process went into the escape? How long did you plan it? Were there accomplices?
I tried to escape once before. I'd planned to escape all along, but the problem was I wasn't equipped for escape. Um, I didn't know. I mean, if you gave me a paper clip, I couldn't open a pair of handcuffs. So that was no good. And I certainly didn't know any locksmithery or any of these kind of tricky stuff. And so I thought to myself, I'll just wait and see what comes up. And something came up. I was sitting in the Yolo County Jail's yard, and this Indian sits down beside me. And he says to me, there's one strand of mesh fencing that's come loose from the weld. And I said, yeah. And he says, yeah. And we look up, and sure enough, the thick, heavy mesh fencing had been welded onto the steel rims, but one piece had come loose. Now, what I didn't know and what he did know was that one piece loose on a mesh fence means there's no fence at all if you work at it. And so we looked over at the guard, and there was a guard watching us all 2 hours we were out in the yard, except that he loved Zane Grey. He loved dusters. So he's always reading these dusters. So we noticed that there was a fence, like a window post, and he was reading, and you could see the yard except this one little window strip. And so I sat and I looked, and I figured out that the angle from that window strip expanded as you go back. And so at one point it was about 2 feet wide. So I stood there. Cornell climbed up, and while this guy was reading his book right in front of God and everybody, I mean, Cornell's working the fence. Well, he couldn't get it open that one day. So anyway, we go back inside, and I'm excited as can be, right? Thinking, well, going to have another kick at the can here. Except somebody dropped a wire to the guards, and I got bagged up about an hour later, but he didn't. And the next day, Cornell just grabbed the tallest guy he found, told him to stand there, climbed up, started working the fence, got his foot in, pushed it open, climbed up on the roof, jumped off the county jail roof. Now, this little Marine who deserted, he just suddenly broke and climbed up the guy like a monkey, and he went out. Except that he jumped off the roof and broke both his ankles, and they found him behind the dumpster there crying and moaning. But anyway, that was my first attempt to escape, and it never happened. So yeah, I missed that one.
How long before the next attempt?
The next one came about 2 years later, something like that.
How many years into your sentence are you now?
Well, the trouble is, those were called 5 to life
I
sentences.
see.
So you never really knew how long your sentence was,
So that motivated you to want to escape.
because there were guys who'd done 12, 15 years on a 5 to life. It just depends on what happens to you inside. So they don't actually, in those days, they didn't have to take you back for another crime. You get into a beef and crack someone's head open, it goes onto your jacket. And then the parole board see it and say, well, we'll see you in a few years there, Mr. Attwood. And years pass and years pass. And in fact, while I was inside, they got rid of those sentences because they were seen as unfair. That they were maybe cruel and unusual punishment, because prisoners never actually knew how long they were going to serve. And some people got out in 2.5 years, and other people did 10 years on the same crime.
Part of the of being on sentence for me, 26 months remand, facing a big, life sentence at 200 years at one point. They told me um, that uncertainty was worse than anything, worse than the violence, worse than the cockroaches, worse than the heat. Just thinking you could possibly never ever get your life back. I just felt that just slowly sending me insane. So I know where you're coming from, definitely.
Well, fortunately, while I was in, they brought in determinate sentencing.
Yeah.
So with just the signature of the governor on a piece of paper, suddenly everybody had fixed dates. And when they had fixed dates, it means you didn't have to perform for the parole board anymore. So nobody went bothered with the psychologist or the psychiatrist anymore. There was no more creeping around the chapel trying to get the priest on your side.
Creeping around the chapel, I like that. So the second escape, then, what's the method and what's the
Well, it was
focus
pretty.
here?
I wanted it to be 100% sure, so I didn't want any convicts involved because, unfortunately, convicts have a tendency to sell information like that um, for their program or for to get out earlier for something, and so I didn't want anyone to know. So there were no convicts involved in my story. So I just waited till I got sent out to the forestry camp. As you probably know, all these forest fires you see on the news being fought in California, 90% of the actual forest fighters are convicts who were basically told, do you want to get out? Well, there you go. And so, of course, if they get burned up in the fire, nobody's crying too much. So,
So you were assigned to fight a fire.
firefighting.
Okay.
That was the job.
This wasn't planned then. This was just you didn't get the job to do that.
Well, no, I was, again, I was always in a good position because I knew how to type. I mean, in the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, right? So that meant I could be the clerk. So the clerk jobs were always sweet jobs because instead of being in the fire line working 20 hours in the hot sun and smoke and cinders and all the rest of it, you sat at your typewriter and drank hot coffees and, pondered your next, whatever you were doing, course, or, if you want to write bad poetry, you could do that too.
So can you take us through the day of your escape?
Well, it was just pretty simple. I just arranged for a friend to, park a couple kilometers down the road and just wait for me late at night. So I crept out of the dormitory, made sure the guards, because of course being the clerk, you knew when the guards were doing their rounds and what was going on. So you just chose a time when the guards were having a snooze, because of course it's 3 o'clock in the morning at a forestry camp. So it was actually there's no drama behind the escape. It was pretty easy.